16 hours if you want. Okay. 16-hour session, anyone? Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good lunchtime. Just saying hello. Welcome to the Falls Prevention Network webinar for this Falls Awareness Week 2022. And just to let you know that this is being recorded. We can't see or hear you, but don't worry about that. More on that in a moment. This is day 2 of the Falls Awareness webinar series, and I'm delighted to say we've got 2 fantastic speakers for you. A little bit background myself. I am Neil. I'm the man who keeps emailing you all, so I really apologise about all of that, but it's good to see over 130 of you signing on already. I'm ably assisted in the background by Simon, who's going to be tweaking knobs and dialing dials, and we'll be dealing with the chat system and the Q&A sessions. As I said, we are recording a bit of housekeeping. Help yourself to tea and coffee. I haven't got anything available for you, I'm afraid. I'm sorry about that. The cameras and microphones, as I said, are off. We'll have the Q&A boxes open for questions. Type your questions in there, and if you're lucky, during the presentations, Professor Dolan and Dr. Arora will actually answer some of those for you, but we will do a Q&A session mop-up at the end as well. If you see a question you sort of said, yeah, I like that one, that's what I wanted to ask, just tick a little like on it, and we know that's the popular questions. If you are able to use Twitter, then follow us at Falls Network or tweet your responses to what's going on. And I shall now welcome officially Professor Brian Dolan, OBE. He's Director of Health Service 360 and Honorary Professor of the University of Salford, Honorary President of Agile UK Physiotherapists for Older People, and creator of End PJ Paralysis and Last 1,000 Days. I forgot to put that one on my notes. And also Dr. Amit Arora, Consultant Geriatrician in the Midlands. He's a Regional Clinical Director there, and he's the Vice President of Workforce at the British Geriatric Society and creator of the Deconditioning Games. More to follow. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to Brian, and we shall now click the right box and put him in face in there. Here we go, over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all of you for joining us. It's brilliant, you know, given the week that's in it and all that. And I was saying earlier to Neil and Simon, and it was just a few minutes before we started, that actually in retrospect I probably could have thought to put in a picture of Her Majesty, you know, the one that was taken as what will I think become an iconic photograph, which was one that was taken the very last public photograph of her, where she's with her stick, and you can see a bruise on her wrist. And what an extraordinary life, an extraordinary woman that she was. You know, in many ways, the embodiment of maintaining good health right to the very end. She made a promise, as we all know, on her 21st birthday, to serve all her life. And, you know, she did exactly that right up to 2 days before she passed. So her likes will not be seen again. So Amit and I are going to spend the next 15 or 16 hours. Apparently, that's how long this Teams thing can go on for, or until 1 o'clock, which they didn't tell us which one. And we'll just chat to you about deconditioning, reconditioning, and then as it happens, it's kind of quite neatly, as I said earlier, Amit, we were saying that I'm going to talk largely about deconditioning and some of the pathophysiological impacts of deconditioning. And then Amit will talk about the Deconditioning Games, and in many respects, which is about reconditioning the nation, which Amit is leading extraordinarily. And then we'll wrap up. Do please ask questions. Without moving my hands, some of these slides are on a timer, so I'll just carry on with a dictionary definition, which, you know, the simplest one in many respects is about the cause to lose fitness or muscle tone, and that sedentary lifestyles decondition their bodies. And then there's Farlax and Partner, who talk about any loss of physical fitness or any inactivity for any reason, but theirs is a slightly narrow one because they focus on the physiological. Whereas, if you next slide, please, if you would, Amit and I, which we'll describe in our own definition, it's a syndrome comprising physical, psychological, and functional decline occurring as a result of prolonged bed rest, but also associated with loss of muscle strength commonly experienced through hospitalization. And I think the key addition we put in is about the psychological and functional decline. But if you're a hospital person in bed, in hospital, you can spend 95% of it in bed or in the chair. It's roughly 83% of the time in bed, 12% of that time in a chair. And a wonderful geriatrician in Nottingham, he did a study, he put pedometers onto patients in a rehab ward, and across a whole weekend, all they did was an average of 12 steps, an average, which is quite extraordinary. So if you're middle-aged, it's about 7,000 steps for good health, 4,000 steps if you're older. A hospitalized patient will be doing well if they're doing 400. And that lack of physical inactivity is believed to lead to around 37,000 premature deaths in England alone. And I suspect that number will significantly increase based on what we've learned as an indirect and unintended consequence of the pandemic. And I often talk elsewhere about deconditioning being the other pandemic. I think we've had 3 pandemics. We've obviously got the COVID one. We've had the pandemic of deconditioning, and we've had the pandemic of loneliness. While Sweden during the lockdowns was lionized as this extraordinary country that didn't need lockdowns, what's been missed in a lot of that discourse is that 45% of people in Sweden live on their own. So their numbers are relatively low, in partly as an indirect consequence of the fact that they're living on their own. However, loneliness is a major problem for them. Maybe the next slide, please, Neil. So Public Health England came up with a very interesting report last summer, I think about July, August of last year. And it's the first time there was a Public Health England report before they changed into the Health Security Agency or something like that. The first time that actually a report had talked very specifically about deconditioning, and they predict an additional 110,000 falls on top of the falls that are already known. But this one they attribute to deconditioning itself, because we've had the world's most successful social experiment in the last year or two. And that experiment was we kept people in their own homes and encouraged them to stay in their own beds. And in their own houses, and that to some extent scared people to stay indoors, and they did. And at our own NPJ paralysis last year, some community physiotherapists from Ireland were talking about people, they weren't going to mass, they weren't going to the GAA, like the Gaelic football and the hurling games. They were staying, their worlds had got much smaller. And because people aren't exercising, because they're not mobilizing, by the time if they need elective surgery, they're also much less fit as well. And 2/3 of, and I would imagine, knowing my beautiful friend Amit, he will have been involved in this work from the British Geriatric Society of 2017, that 2/3 of older people experience decline in function during hospitalization. And deconditioning can mean the difference between going home and going to a home. Maybe the next slide, please. Thing is, we've known about this. This is not our first rodeo. We've known about it since one of the 20 most influential papers in the history of the British Medical Journal in the 20th century. Richard Asher wrote about the dangers of going to bed 6 months before the birth of the NHS in 1947. And he didn't talk about deconditioning, but he had talked about every single body system, and every single one of them was impacted. And that was, what, 75 years ago now. But if you go back even further, Neil, to the next slide, please. You go back even further, right back in 1899, Dr. Emil Rees in New York found that, to put people on their own feet in a short time rather than being confined to beds. And in that one, he did a study that every patient, irrespective of what treatment they had, was got out of bed after 2 days, and that was a sample size around 400. They all went home sooner, and none of them experienced poorer outcomes. Also, the John Powers work. This was, I think, during 1944. Again, the abuse of rest as a therapeutic measure in society. So things shifted in healthcare. The needs didn't change, but the approaches to people most certainly did. And let's look, if we get into the next slide, please. If you look at even and start drilling into what it does, is you look back to the likes of Florence Nightingale. I mean, I couldn't be a nurse and not talk about Florence. You know, right back in 1878, and we're now looking, what, 130 years or more, 134 years ago. Actually, more than that, 144 years. You know, and now a well-known rule to keep no patient in hospital a day longer than is absolutely necessary. And even this maybe today is too long, because the patient may have to recover not only from illness or injury, but from hospital. And that little piece there has always said two things to me. One is that Florence absolutely appreciated the value of patients' time. So that was one bit. And the other bit was she recognized that deconditioning, even if that language was never used back there, was really an issue, a problem for patients. May I have the next slide, Neil? And also, could my chat be unmuted, if you would, please? And we just go back one slide, if we may. Oh, no, in fact, that's it. That's fine. And back forward again. My apologies, Neil. There's a bit of a rogue. So if you go forward, that's the one. So Amit and I shamelessly were plugging this, but this is a free. You can all access this free if you look up my name and Amit's name and looking up to Avoiding Elsevier in a book by that's been published about rehabilitation, is a free chapter from Elsevier, which you're all very welcome to have, or take a photograph of the slide and you'll be able to see the bit.ly reduced thing. Next slide, please. So let's get into the detail and into the weeds of it and look at the impact of bed rest on older people. So muscle strength, we know one of the most obvious ones, one we know best, you know, 1 to 1.5% decrease, forgive me, per day of activity, up to 20% in the first week. And it's the big lower limb anti-gravity muscles that are most affected. Next slide, next point. And that can combined leads to a muscle mass of up to 1.5 kilos, which is 1 kilo comes from the hips, the glutes, and the quads, which are the ones that enable people to stand, which will also explain why 17% of medical patients may walk in, but need a frame to walk out, or a walker. Next element with the bone demineralization that occurs and the loss of total body calcium. So bones actually do get weaker, and 4% of all patients who sustain a fractured neck or femur in hospital do so while in hospital. So 1 in 25 people break their hips in hospital, and partly that relates to the circulatory volume that decreases. People stand up, they get dizzy, they've lost the bone density, and by the time they've hit the floor, they've probably ripped the head off the acetabulum in a number of cases. We may go to the next slide. And the VO2 max, I had a drive-by shooting with COVID back in April, so as a gift for my birthday, and I was one of the very lucky ones. I only felt crook the day before I tested positive. Then I had 10 days, 2 weeks waiting for a freedom swab to get that happening. But I knew my VO2 max had dropped in that time because I was kind of grounded. So the ability of at cellular level to use and utilize oxygen drops off very, very quickly. So it impacts directly on fitness. Next bullet point, which leads about the lungs. So the secretions get thicker, the cough becomes inefficient, and the reason it is instead of using all of your rib cage, you're only using half of them because you're lying on your back, which then leads to an increased risk of pneumonia, as well as the secretions getting thicker. Blood glucose itself, you know, anyone who uses a watch, mine's on charge right now, it'll get a reminder every hour to stand up, because that is about the insulin being reduced, and the insulin binding sites are impacted by it, and it takes a fortnight just before that glucose response returns to normal. Next bullet point, please. Constipation because of reduced peristalsis, because people are horizontal rather than vertical. You don't have the gravity feed through the bowel. Fluid intake is being reduced, so people start to get constipated. But not only that, the UTI, as a consequence of the increased diuresis and the calcium leaching, is likely to lead to kidney stone formation in 15 to 30% of patients. Plus, as we all know, skin integrity is compromised. We're very quickly mentioning if somebody's using a bottle or somebody is using a bedpan, they are probably, particularly if they're using bottles, they're not like, then there'll still be some urine in the bladder because it's not being fully emptied, which then acts as a reservoir for infections that are more likely to develop a UTI. And there's a wonderful ward in Scotland, a stroke ward, where they have banned bedpans and commodes. So it shows what can be done. The next slide, if you would, please, Neil, and then just those bullet points. And it's about the psychological impact. The get up and go has got up and gone, the torpor, the loss of independence. If you're not burning calories because you're not mobilizing, you're not going to get hungry. And what we need is people with a higher protein load when they're in hospital. But actually, a third of people come into hospital undernourished as it is. As an aside of that, I can't help but wondering what the impact of the cost of living crisis that we're facing in terms of undernutrition and how that'll affect people as well. So we live in very interesting times. So in a different way of framing this is if you're in hospital for a week, you can lose 20% of quads power, 1.5 kilos of muscle, 10% of aerobic capacity, but it ties into bone loss, muscle weakness, increase in disability, a 5-fold increase in the risk of needing institutional care on discharge, and pressure sores, falls, malnutrition, sensory deprivation, because boredom is a major problem in hospitals. Dr. Lizzie Burns is a scientist and an artist who works, for example, with University College Hospital, but for a number of years, her thing is about boredom and doing our origami to reduce the risk of boredom. If anyone looks on our npjparalysis.org website, you'll be able to see her incredible presentation from the summit. Next slide. If you think about frail older adults, and this is the work of Falvey 2015, they just travel along over time, and then it's a gentle slog. But effectively, somebody, and most of us know this from family members, people we know, people we love, if they get hospitalized, it kind of falls off a cliff. And I've seen it in my own extended family. That functional reserves drops off so quickly, and being sick and in hospital really does have iatrogenic consequences. Have the next slide, please. So what happens if you're hospitalized? You're 61 times to 100 times more likely to develop a disability in activities of daily living than those who have not been hospitalized. As I mentioned before, almost 1 in 5, 1 in 6 older medical patients who walked into hospital 2 weeks prior to admission or walking around needed help, and that's quite a troubling, that's a significantly troubling statistic. And for a Singaporean study, what they found that deconditioning contributed to delayed discharge in a fully 47% of older people, nearly half of them. Which then kind of leads us to a natural question, which is this: is the patient safe for admission? May sometimes be a better question than is the patient safe for discharge. We always used to say, go to hospital, you'll be safe there, and now we're all going, yeah, about that. So we need to rethink what we think about stuff, and in part of my piece of work in this space, not just the MPJ process, is Professor Linda Holt and I, if you will, next slide, are working on a book, and I discovered actually more than half of it's written. It'll be a short book, but it's what is it? The body of evidence, some of which I've described. How do you mobilize people? How do you get people to participate in the sort of things that Amit is describing in the Deconditioning Games, which we will celebrate as a case study? So it's those sorts of things that we're putting in together. Just as an aside, Amit has very kindly popped in a comment in the chat box. I don't think I've got access to the chat, Neil and Simon. If you're able to enable me to access that, if you would, please. But to ask you to multitask, if you would, could you move to the next slide? Because here's the thing, and Amit and I were talking about this yesterday, and it's about sarcopenia. That's an interesting way that the slide has presented itself, but from where I am here. But if you do an MRI of a 31-year-old, you would see the strong muscle bulk, and then the slide, which has done its own thing, it showed a cross section of an older person with a lot more white mass, and white representing fat, and then a 73-year-old. And what we tend to assume is somehow that is the consequence of the inevitable decline related to aging. But if you go forward one, and let's see what that slide does. There's a perfectly good one that was prepared earlier. You see this 40-year-old triathlete, a 74-year-old sedentary man, again, all that white. The polite term is adipose tissue, but we know it as fat. But look at that 70-year-old athlete, triathlete. If you look closely, he's actually got even more muscle mass than the 40-year-old. So muscle bulk and power is far more to it. Activity, particularly load-bearing activity. The worst thing we can do with our parents ever is say, oh, I'll put them into a bungalow because I was worried about them falling down the stairs. That's what's keeping them upright. That's what's keeping them. And for both Amit and I, when we saw this some while ago now, for both of us, this was a real, head changer, changed how we saw things. And we were chatting about that stuff only yesterday. May I have the next slide? Because here's the wonderful Chris Tuckett, physio director, deputy director even of Allied Health at North East London, where he talks about patients don't stop moving because they've deconditioned. They've deconditioned because they've stopped moving. And in the next slide, you'll see, and again, a big shout out to Chris. Falls are often thought to be a problem of mobility, but actually the reality is it's about immobility. You see that super fit 70-odd-year-old triathlete, and you see how actually they would have far fewer risks associated because they are so mobile and active. So if you would, what actually happens? What have we socialized people into doing? We've been saying to them, now stay in bed because, we don't want you to hurt yourself. We don't want you to fall. We don't want you to come to harm. So there's been this narrative of people stay stock still, steadily settling there to deconditioning. And what we're doing is, with the best intentions, with the kindest heart, we are absolutely killing our patients with kindness. We're killing them because we don't want them to come to harm. But the harm event is in the immobility rather than, and in fact, even the language of falls prevention, to my mind, has never been quite right. Where we should be framing away from a deficit model of thinking is to an asset model of thinking, which is about how do we enhance safer mobility, acknowledging the falls will occur occasionally, but harm will occur always when people are not moving. And if you look at the, why all of this stuff matters, here's 3 reasons. Patients' time is the most important currency in healthcare, and social care. And while our time is busy and important, our patients' time is sacred. 48% of people over the age of 85 will die within 1 year of a hospital admission. This is the wonderful work of Clark et al. In Glasgow and in 2014. And finally, here's is germane and key to it all, which is, if you had 1,000 days left to live, how many would you choose to spend in hospital? And I suspect for all of us, the answer would be none. But we've had this narrative, this story we've told for such a long time, that people come into hospital, they get into their pajamas, and then they are paralyzed in their pajamas till the day they leave. And so that's why with the next slide is about sharing the message with patients. This is a physio and an OT who did this lovely leaflet, and more of them have emerged over the years now, because we are helping to rewrite the narrative. The brilliant, outstanding work that Amit has led around the get up, get dressed, get moving, and we're both clear whether whatever is called, we all want the same thing, is to avoid needless harm to people. And those people, by the way, include staff, because there's nothing worse, and happened to me, and I even to this day I remember patient falling in front of you, don't get to them in time, massive egg on their forehead, and you go home thinking, should I be on the nursing register? Because it is so crushing to one's spirit to see someone coming to harm on your watch. It's nothing less than a moral injury. But when we get people dressed, and when we encourage people to do this, from the brilliant Sonia Sparkles, we start to get the idea that people can do things, that they can start to change things, but by giving them the evidence as well as connection to the spirit, it changes how they feel about stuff. If we would, the next slide as well, please. I see, this is the thing. It's that cognitive shift that occurs when people are dressed. They start to feel better, they look better, their family tell them they're much better. But when we did the 70-day challenge in 2018 across the NHS, we were getting feedback from registrars, which was they were discharging more people at the weekends because they felt if they're fit to go, they look fit to go, let's let them go, instead of waiting till the rounds on Monday. And never underestimate as an individual what you can do, what impact you can have. If you would, the next slide. And this is one of the people who I love to bits. And on the right hand side, this is Chloe Harris, who was then a brand new physio, new grad physio in Salisbury. And you know, he started encouraging her, because of a family story, started encouraging the staff to wear their PJs at work. So this is the woman who started the whole thing with people wearing the PJs at work, because when you start to wear it, actually it starts to change how you start to see things. If you go to the next slide, having fun, introducing it with a serious point really makes a big difference to people, because once you experience the experience of being the vulnerability that comes with being in pajamas, it changes you. And it's localizing it to the next slide finally before I pass on to Amit, which is making it local. And I love this that they've done, Derek Lader and the crew in NHS Highland, about Donald, where's your trousers? Because that's how
I'm in for a nop, just a normal guy. I've got no breeks, just a gown to tie, and the nurses shout when I go by, Donald, where's your trousers? When I wear my gown to the RDS, it looks just like a mini dress, and it makes the nurses shout and stress, singing, Donald, where's your trousers? Let the window high, let the window low, through the wards in my gown I'll go. All the nurses say, oh no, Donald, where's your trousers? To wear a gown is no delight, clothes are best, I know that's right. Pajamas should only be worn at night, in the daytime wear your trousers.
There you go. So you totally get the gist, where they brought a famous Scottish song, they rewrote the words, and they made it fun. So the harm is now reaching the communities. So how do we encourage people? This is, if you like, the intro to where Amit comes in, which is about the reconditioning the nation. And that's about encouraging people to wear the clothes they want, having the lunch at a table, doing some bits and pieces, stretching their legs, all of that stuff that makes a real difference away from deconditioning to reconditioning. And over to you, Amit.
And thank you, Brian, for such a lovely and thought-provoking presentation and discussion, and it's such a pleasure to actually hear you all the time. And thanks for the very kind introduction too, Neil. So where do we start? I haven't got a ready kind of script or presentation, so I'm speaking from my heart really. But what I do know is that the various national and international reports during the pandemic and since while we are still in the pandemic, we have all kind of noted how the pandemic has adversely affected the physical, the functional, the psychological well-being of populations, and how older people have been disproportionately affected in this. And when I say older people, yes, they may have been disproportionately affected, but that doesn't mean that the younger people and those living at home and those living in care homes, etc., have not been affected. And I will touch on this very briefly. But building on what Brian has said, the identification of deconditioning as a syndrome over the last 5 or 6 years has really attracted very widespread attention globally, following the increased awareness of harms of inappropriately prolonged bed rest, which were actually initially described by the great Hippocrates, and more recently in 1947, as Brian said, by Richard Asher, and subsequently a few others. But I think by now there is really sufficient evidence in favor of activity and exercise for older people, and Brian has kind of demonstrated that in his slides. So I'm not going to touch on those, but it is, I think, now that we know. Oh gosh, just a second. Now that my timer is going to switch my computer monitor, the second computer monitor off, so there might be a 10-second gap before it switches into the main screen, but hopefully it won't be too bad. So, but I think that now that there is enough evidence of beneficial effects of activity and exercise on older people, I think it is really important now to identify those behavior change techniques and implement those strategies that will prevent deconditioning at scale and at speed. And I think now more than ever, there is an urgent and growing need to shift that focus from just avoiding deconditioning to promoting reconditioning. And as we emerge from this pandemic, I think it's really key that we employ those technologies which will enable us, which will shift the focus from deconditioning to promotion of reconditioning. I think this really is the time when we can move on from just that deconditioning awareness and prevention campaign that we started in 2016 to establishing those reconditioning approaches. And with this in mind, and following the success from the East of England Winter Deconditioning Games in 21-22, where 178 teams from various sectors took part, the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team, supported by colleagues from within the NHS and social care, are embarking on a program called Reconditioning the Nation. And this program aims to prevent deconditioning by encouraging all sectors in the health and social care arena to come up with innovative, with fun ways to promote physical activity, functional activity, and to encourage that emotional well-being. And it is really hoped that this will reduce the deconditioning and its associated harms. It will also improve hospital discharges, and it will also improve patient outcomes. I think I'll probably just go back about 25-30 years. I was a young man in my 30-year, I think it was about 30 when I had a emergency appendectomy at the time. And those days it wasn't the laparoscopic stuff, it was more the traditional wide 6-inch cut in the groin and taking the appendectomy out. And after the operation, one, I couldn't walk much, and two, I was told by the doctors, and you always do what the doctor tells you to do. So I took plenty of bed rest for about 7 to 10 days. And after that, when I started to try and walk and get out of my house, I just could not do that. So at the time, I wasn't aware what was happening, and I was kind of hoping things will get better, and things did get better over a period of time. And coming over, then I became a consultant, and I would see patients in the emergency department, manage them, give them a plan of treatment, etc., and would hope that they would go home in 2, 3, 4, 5 days time. But quite often I would actually find these people still in a hospital bed 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later. And I wondered, why did that happen? It was only in the last few years that we started to uncover that evidence, the evidence that Brian said that, well, most patients do not even walk 12 steps in a day. Most patients stay 90% of their time in their bed and maybe a little bit in their chair. And no wonder when they are ready to go home, they need a Zimmer frame, or they might need an increase in the care package and so on. And when we started looking at that evidence, which was kind of becoming increasingly clear as to where we were going wrong. And Brian touched about the moral injury to the staff, and that is tremendous. I suffered that moral injury because, one, I had faced this myself, and two, I could see how our staff, our colleagues, were struggling with that not being able to mobilize patients because of a variety of reasons, and the fact that they were thinking at times that could it be that bed rest which was causing some of the problems. And we came up with this model, which is now popular, which about the NPJ paralysis and get up, get rest, keep moving, and so on. So I think there is a lot we can do. And as a young person, I could kind of recondition myself, although at the time I did not have a clue about the words deconditioning and reconditioning. But I think what the bottom line is, deconditioning is preventable and reconditioning is possible. So with those things in mind, we kind of came up with the Deconditioning Games in the east of England, and some examples of how others have used this opportunity to aid patients to sit up, to get rest, to keep moving. These are available from teams who have done this before, and we are hoping that teams will generate their own ideas, will implement them locally with support and encouragement from peers, other teams, and other colleagues, and details of some ideas and further resources and some toolkit will also be available in the next few days and weeks. I would like to see to show you what some other teams have done, so as to give you some ideas. But the main theme is to have fun in these games and make our day job a little bit easier. So with that in mind, can I just ask Neil if you wouldn't mind to move on to the next slide, please. So this is what happened in the Luton and Dunstable Hospital, making a difference. So a lot of people were doing exercises on pedometers, and we were measuring their step count by giving them the pedometers and giving them these pedal bikes and so on. Can I see the next slide, please? So this bit is around making more examples of making a difference in, again, using virtual walks, using pedal bikes, static pedals in a dialysis unit. So somebody lost 6 kilos in weight while doing pedaling while she used to attend the dialysis, where some patients got feeling better, 100% emotional well-being. Some commented, I won't manage at home, I can't do anymore, and it's good to move about a bit more. And it felt good to be able to do something, not just here. And there was another group who walked up to the Essex coastline, another group who did a virtual walk in a care home to the Southend seafront. And when they actually measured the number of steps which were needed to go up to the Southend seafront, they actually took the residents to the Southend seafront for an afternoon tea. Some colleagues did Winter Wimbledon at the time, and some did the balloon games or sitting in the chair exercises and so on. And next slide, please. And then the second bit was around supporting people to keep moving, and this was measuring about what could they do and what could they not do and what could we enable them to do. And next slide, please. So there are some examples here. So how many patients were off the trolley, how many patients were dressed, how many patients were getting improved nutritional support, how many patients had active goal plans, and how many were using a good equipment or toileting. And then some people did SBC charts. So it's not about prescribing what people can do and what people should do, etc. But it's more about people, teams, organizations identifying their own possible things that they could do. Can I see the next slide, please? And so similarly, there was a innovation care there, a group of people getting together and developing some ideas of what they could do, etc. Can I see the next slide, please, now? And this is the video which I want you to see because it summarizes some of the work that the teams in East of England did. So it's only about three minutes long. So have a look, generate some ideas of your own while you watch this. These games are not about telling anybody what to do, but this is more about bringing out some fun in our day jobs. And whilst we focus on some patient-centered activities, whilst we improve their outcomes, there will also be an opportunity to apply for medals, and it will be part of a national movement to recondition our nation. So have a look at the video and I'll come back to you how to join in, etc.
Yeah, what are you saying? Video.
We can't see the video. I can hear the music, but I can't see the video.
Lovely lively music.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've embedded it in everything.
Yeah, not to worry. But I think what we'll do is we'll probably share the link to the video a bit later on to the audience. But I think the bottom line is that we will encourage participation of various teams from hospitals, from care homes, from councils, from communities, and any other organizations. Invite you all to help us, to support us, to guide us, but above all, join this movement to improve patient outcomes, to improve staff morale, and make our work fun. We know that deconditioning can change lives of patients and also their families. Imagine the 90-year-old man whose wife now has to spend more time looking after the husband while she herself is in a difficult age in terms of helping out others, or the son and the daughter who may have to leave their job, or the grandchildren who are suffering that injury of seeing their grandparents becoming frail and older. I think it is easier to prevent this. It is better to recondition, and there has never been more relevance than for this than during and after the pandemic. Deconditioning can change lives for worse. Reconditioning can change lives for the better. The question is, how many lives are we prepared to change? Come and join us. Recondition the nation. Thank you.
That's a lovely, powerful way of framing it. And for those who are thinking, well, what can I do? I think that the key thing is, go back one slide if you would, Neil, please, is to put the energy into things you can do stuff about. Back one slide, please. And focus on the things you can control. Because sometimes what we do is we put our energy into things we have that's our circle of concern, if you will. But if we put our energy into things we can do stuff, and it's keeping it really small, that is what can make the difference. And if we go to the next slide, it's recognizing that in the end, this isn't about roles, this isn't about staffing, it isn't about less than staffing than we imagine, and it isn't about the money. Culture doesn't change just because we want it to change. Culture changes because when the behavior and everyday realities change. And you look at the great work that's been done, you know, we've got the likes of, and you know, Amit and I would be remiss not to shout out Geraldine Rogers and Debbie and Josh and Emma and all the amazing folk in the East of England. Their staffing is as poor as everyone. But what they have done, because they've connected to the purpose of why this stuff matters, they have made remarkable achievements. And the National Reconditioning Games are about that opportunity to reconnect to person and to purpose. And Charlotte asked, you know, I'm due to start a project working with acute therapist staff, encourage more positive risk taking to get patients out of hospital into community services earlier and away from rehab units. Any advice working with acute staff? And there's a couple. I mean, the first time I've written here, you know, there's 3 dimensions to change. And the first is you'd start with the heart. It's hearts, minds, and hands. We don't make decisions rationally. We make them emotionally and then apply post hoc rationalization to justify decisions we make. It's always about that. But once you create, connect through story, and you know, that's how we make sense of the world. What is that story? Go back one. That makes the difference. The second one is, once people are opened up to the notion of the connection to this story makes sense to me, then people are more open to insights and awareness. The harm that is caused by deconditioning, the unintended consequences of keeping people in a hospital system. You know, the positive risk taking is acknowledging that if we take no risks, our patients take all of the risks. And we also need to acknowledge that, you know, rehabs are beds, into my mind, are an indirect sign of system failure, because too many patients go to rehabilitation to recondition from the deconditioning that has occurred while they're in their acute phase. So we will know we're doing really good work when we start to see the closure of or reconfiguration of rehab beds. And I'm in Stratford-on-Avon now. I was in Sydney last week, and there was a rehab, divisional rehab, or sorry, actually district, you know, regional rehab nurse, and she came up halfway through the 2 days that this has completely changed how I think about what I think about stuff. So heart, heads, and hands is, okay, so what are the things you need to do? What are the tactics that you need to have? But in the end, the roads always lead to people, and the roads always leads to culture. And never underestimate the impact that one person can have on other people by just saying, maybe we could make this happen. So we'll finish on that and go to the final slide, which is how to get hold of Amit and I on Twitter. I put in the npjparalysis.org/join, so you can see a lot of presentations. But the other thing is, we're going to link the National Deconditioning Games website onto our page and vice versa. So we'll certainly want to look at that as well. So answering the question, Hazel, Anne-Marie and Amit are doing, Anne-Marie Riley, who's the Chief Nurse in UHNM, University Hospital North Midlands, and Amit are doing some really interesting work. So probably get in touch with Amit in the first place and go from there will be my suggestion. This is, and Amit, and we haven't got many questions, but do you want to pick up that point about capturing deconditioning? Because I know this is a passion of yours as well as Anne-Marie's. Oh, thank you. These are our emails address as well.
Are you all right with me sharing those?
Yeah, no, please, that's what they're for. Thank you. Thanks, Neil. Appreciate that. Amit, do you want to talk about your work you and Anne-Marie are doing in there?
Yes, I think, again, deconditioning causes harm. Now, the question is, do we know what harm? I think we do know what harm. Do we measure it? No. Should we measure it? Yes. Will we then convert it into the same kind of industry that has happened, that we start doing a DATEX and then we start investigating and then we go into root cause analysis and then everybody is busy doing those root cause analysis and DATEXs, but actually not all the time things happen. So one of the things which I think me and Anne-Marie particularly is very passionate about this, and this is now part of our hospital quality strategy in terms of the ward-based work, because this is largely an inpatient hospital, is changing the terminology. And Brian, you touched upon this very kindly. So if we are investigating a falls, do we actually call it falls? What about using a different terminology, using something like safe mobility practices, for example? So, and it was only yesterday, very, very new, God bless her, she probably didn't have full idea, very new healthcare assistant was telling one of the patients who was trying to get out of the bed was to stay in the bed, because if you fall, you'll break your bone. Now, I think there is a lot of work we need to do around those practices. They still exist. They still exist in my own workplace, where we've been kind of talking about this for a few years. But I think it is really, really important to capture the harm, and those harms can be from the individual harms, which Brian, you described very kindly, but also to the harms to the patient's families. For example, the patient's grandchildren who are deprived of seeing their grandparents dressed in their own clothes and walking to the toilet and eating their own food and taking them to the movies or the park or playing games or telling them stories, for example. But also think about those prolonged harms that can happen to other people, the harms that might happen because the bed is occupied by a patient who has been deconditioned, and because that bed is occupied, there is an ambulance waiting in the front door of the hospital, waiting to unload a patient into the emergency department. But go a step backwards. What about the harm to the patient who is sitting in their own home, and the ambulance can't even reach them because they are tied up in the hospital front door or tied up in fetching another person or patient? So there is a lot of harm. You touched on staff moral injuries, for example, and that is quite a serious issue, really, because that will eventually turn out into burnout and will all exacerbate the current issues we have with the workforce challenges in the United Kingdom and probably worldwide, really, to be honest. But also, I think there is, how do we capture that harm is another issue. Now, we don't always measure it, but one way, as a starting question, could be that if we are doing any DATEX for anything, so let us say it's a falls or a pressure sore or whatever else, if we included a question, let us say in these words, this is what Anne-Marie says all the time, is could deconditioning have played a role in this DATEX? And that one simple question could actually alert people, alert staff into thinking about it. So that could be one. And now, by no means a huge advocate of a DATEX industry, but because it takes away staff time from patient care into paper care. So I think we got to be careful about, do we document yes, we should document everything, but do we investigate every data? And I don't think it's about an individual harm. It is, but more importantly, at this stage, it is more about the culture change, more about the behavior change. And the sooner we bring it, the better it is. And that would be one way of preventing that immense harm that we see all the time. And I would say again, that deconditioning at present is probably one of the most underdiagnosed, under-recognized, and under-reported issues in healthcare worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a comment that's been made, and you know, I won't relitigate all you've said, because other than agreeing, it may well be one way we kind of capture decondition will be via proxy measures. We know, for example, there's a massive sample size of around 250,000 plus of a study that was done earlier this year, published this year, which show that there's an additional death for every 82 patients waiting more than 5 hours in an ED waiting for admission. So when we start to track across the system, we can start to get a sense of the level of harm that's being raised. There's a question, and my apologies if I don't quite get the gist of the conversation, the question, which is, when we say falls is due to mobility, I can think of my patient load where patients put them on floor. When staff is trying to mobilize them, will that be classed as a fall? It is behavioral issue. What should we do to prevent that? Suggestions, please. I don't know, honestly, if, and hopefully others can pop in to offer some suggestions. If I have understood the question, it sounds like it's behavior if the patients themselves are getting on the floor, so that feels behavioral rather than a fall. And that's a conversation with the patients and those around, so that there is understanding. We saw a few physios in the community, patients waiting months to be seen after they have been in hospital, which doesn't help start reconditioning. Absolutely, send out exercise program to them. As a triage call would help if we could see them sooner. That would help lots. And I think the most untapped resource in healthcare are patients and their families, especially when families are brought into the conversation about why this is so important. And I saw this with my father-in-law-ish, if I can put it there, it's complicated. He was, when he was in hospital, in Warwick Hospital, they had a goals mobility over every patient's bed. And the conversation with one patient and his son was, Dad, look, we need to get you going 10 meters 4 or 5 times a day, so I'll go for a walk with you. I'll get you for. So the family member was actually part of that person's journey. Thinking the physio, physios and in fact anyone, we've got 50% fewer district nurses than we had a decade ago. The more we can tap into resource where appropriate of family, the more that will help us as well. We have, and by the way, the staffing issue, it's a global issue. The only thing that changes in healthcare is the accent, because the conversations about staffing shortages were going on last week in Sydney, just as they do here. Linked to the posters, there is on the NHS Futures, the East of England folk have very kindly posted a whole bunch of my stuff. If anyone is happy to email me, I will send them the link to that, as long as they can access NHS Futures. Any further questions? Maybe Amit, if you're happy, I appreciate we only got a few more minutes. Are you happy to pick up that question around fibromyalgia? It's quite a technical one.
Yes. So the simple answer is I don't know of any specific studies that have been undertaken in patients with fibromyalgia. What I would say is that this is all a very, we're talking about a personalized care plan, personalized goal setting here. We're not, and I wouldn't want any person to feel kind of demoralized because the patient next to their bed can do 5 meters more than I can do, for example. So it's not a competition. And I think people with fibromyalgia and some similar other conditions it's a different, well-identified challenge. It's not, as you said, Brian. It is technical. But the program of deconditioning, reconditioning is very much personal as well. So it's more about personalized care plan, personalized goals, rather than a generic goal that everybody should do 10,000 steps. I can't do 10,000 steps. I may only be able to do 9,999, for example, or much less, to be honest. But it's not about a generic one. It's very much about a personalized care plan. Do what you can.
And I think that very neatly, kind of towards bringing it to a close, is we can get very overwhelmed at the system impact of deconditioning, and it is a massive impact. But what we can do is work with one person each day. It's not saying we only do one person a day, but each person is one heart, one mind, one conversation at a time. Because change doesn't occur top down, bottom up. It occurs side by side. Those elbow to elbow conversations. That's how we make the changes happen. And this is stuff we must do. And the reason we must do it is our NHS has never been under such pressure. But there's little things we can do that we can help, and that includes encouraging people to lean into ways to help them get better, get up, get dressed, and get moving. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Brian and Amit. That has been an enthralling session. There's a lot of, it's not a chat box, a Q&A box. I think there's a little bit of a difference. We need to explain that next. Next, we're learning as we go, seat to the pants stuff, Q&A. So there's a lot going on there. And just to reiterate a couple of points that come up, yes, the presentations will be made available. The recording will be made available after the event. In fact, if you want to go back and watch it, you can leave, exit the meeting, come back, click it and watch it all over again. It's better than catch up TV. If there's nothing on Netflix tonight, you've always got the Falls webinars to look at. Thank you both for a brilliant session and for your engagement, and it's been a great pleasure to see you both, and good to see you back in Hobbiton as well, Brian.
yeah, sadly I'm not the size of the mountains, it's the other way around.
You got me a bit confused there. So I'm going to sign off now, close the meeting down, and thank you very much again. And don't forget, we have 2 more webinars to run this week as well. Same time, same place, this little yellow room. Tomorrow is Toby Elmer's PhD talking about the fear of falling, and on Friday we have Dr. Emma Stanmore talking about COCU, keep on, keep up. So all ties in with deconditioning and mobility. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye now. Stay safe.